Fantastic. All right. Well, welcome again, everyone. So my name is Paul Van Meter. Let me just jump to the next slide here. I am one of the co-founders of ProShop ERP, and I'm very excited today to welcome Darryl, with the founder of Trust Unlimited. Hey, Darryl, how's it going?
It's going great. How about you?
Couldn't be more excited. And we're having like our first real summer day in the Northwest. So it is finally like warm and sunny. So I am pumped for that as well. Um, let's see here. Darryl, why don't you tell us a little bit about you?
Sure. And I don't seem to be getting the slides, so I'm not sure if others are or not, but
Oh, thank
I'm
you.
just seeing the three of us.
Thank you.
There we go.
There's the slides.
Yes,
Good
so
reminder.
folks will see my picture there with my guide dog Drake, so I'm legally blind. Um, I was born and raised in northern British Columbia, small town. Um, Moved to Victoria and wrote my master's thesis on working in native land claims, and then did my doctoral thesis on building trust in hostile environments at Duke University. And I've spent about the last 20 years helping people better understand what trust is and how it works, and most importantly, how to build it.
hmm Well, we got connected with you sometime last year in 2021 and went through a 12-week course that you offered, and it was with our senior leadership team, and it was so impactful that we just myself and my partners just were talking about how little trust there seems to be in the business world these days, and I guess in the world in general. And it's such a critical thing for customers, for employees, for stakeholders. So that's really what we're here to talk about today. And I appreciate you sharing your wisdom with our audience. So I always like to share our mission statement because it is just core to what we do. So we deliver powerful manufacturing software by deeply understanding our clients' challenges in order to meaningfully improve their businesses and in turn their communities. And it's the communities part that's just so important to me. Um, just the importance of the manufacturing sector to our economy, to local economies, and just the sort of rising tide lifts all boats concept. So why are we bringing this topic of trust to the marketplace, to our audience today? As I already said, we did a 12-week course with Darryl, with our team. I'd say we already had pretty good trust in our team. You know, my partners and I have worked together for 20 plus years, have a great group of folks that have a really great culture and believe in what we're doing. But still, we knew we could still up our game, and so having Darryl come and talk to us about it just seemed like it made a lot of sense. And like I said, that course was something that we did over the course of 8 weeks. We met many times. We had homework. Felt like college again, but it was worthwhile. We chose team members and family members that we went and had trust conversations with. We learned the formulas for trust, which we'll share with you in a little bit here. And we just think it's imperative in business, especially today, to have high levels of trust in your team for retention and just having your team perform at a high level. And of course, trust with clients is the utmost importance, right? Without trust with clients and shareholders and stakeholders, you just cannot have a business, right? Your clients have to trust you to do business with you. So there's things that you can do to pull those levers, and we'll talk about the levers in a little while. So that's really why we're here talking with Darryl about this.
Right. And a big part of the challenge is that I think we all realize that trust matters. But I suspect that we've got some people on the webinar today dreading that I'm going to talk about, let's chant rhythmically or let's hold hands or let's sing kumbaya. And none of that happens, right? It's about
Correct.
understanding a very practical applied approach to realizing here's how people decide whether to trust you or not. And here's some things you can actually do about it.
hmm And before we launch into these, uh, just the little bit of housekeeping I did not do. If you have questions, and I'm sure those questions will come up, please put them in the Q&A part of the meeting, not the chat. It gets a little lost into the chat. So please put in the Q&A. And at the end, we'll definitely leave room for that, and we'll also run a 2-question poll at the end. So I'd love for you to stick around for that as well. So, all right, let's get going here. So, obviously, inside the organization, it really matters. You want to talk a little bit about that, Darryl?
Yeah, the research we've seen is really consistent. It shows that higher trust levels lead to higher levels of productivity, higher levels of efficiency, better innovation, particularly in times that are as chaotic as we're seeing now. Um, Organizations work more effectively and more efficiently, and that's from really broad levels of the organization itself down to specific teams, down to even lower than that, those individual colleague relationships or the roles of leaders. We see people being more effective and more capable when trust levels are higher.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And how everyone, I'm sure, is familiar over the last couple of years with COVID, voluntary resignations, people leaving their jobs, the mass resignation has been staggering. And I
Yeah,
know that a lot of when a lot of people leave their organizations, they say it's because they don't feel connected, they don't maybe trust the leaders. They sometimes pay, of course, but how? I mean, I was doing a little bit of research for actually a presentation I gave last week at a conference about our culture, our personal company culture,
right.
and voluntary resignations over the last 2 years was close to 40% sort of economy wide, just a crazy statistic.
Yeah,
Um, and here in our company, we've grown over the last 2 years from about 24 team members to about 60, and we've only had 2 people choose to leave the company in all of that time.
yeah.
I gotta believe that the level of trust that we have built um, has got to be a part of that, right?
It's a huge element, and you guys you're well ahead of the curve in terms of trust levels within your organization and the way you think about it. And I don't want people to be sitting there thinking I'm just glad handing or I'm blowing smoke, but
Mm-hmm.
I work with a lot of different companies, and we see high turnover rates or low levels of employee engagement. We see people getting increasingly frustrated and disillusioned. And one of the things that the pro shop seems to do is have a real focus on corporate culture. And we saw from your mission statement, right, that your focus isn't on producing the best product. It's about,
Well, we do that too.
you do that too, right? But but you do that as part of the perspective of enabling your clients. And so
Sure.
your
Yeah.
people focus is so sharp and clear, and it resonates throughout the entire organization. And when we get to that place where people are feeling like, hey, we're all pulling in the same direction, we all have a shared mission and goals and objectives, so building the best product becomes just part of that mission,
Sure.
and your focus becomes more people related,
Yeah.
and that pays off so well. Particularly, we're seeing the lowest trust levels we've ever seen. The research is pretty consistent, and every year there are new polls that come out that say this is the worst we've ever seen. No, wait, now this is the worst we've ever seen.
Mm-hmm.
We're seeing divisions along geopolitical lines. We're seeing divisions around specific topics. Places like ProShop that can create a safe harbor, that can create strong relationships with their clients, actually have a massive advantage. It's a huge source of competitive advantage for organizations that can create an environment where people inside the organization feel a high level of trust and engagement and connection,
Mm-hmm.
but also where clients and stakeholders feel that.
Yeah. And working with so many shops, of course, I get to peer inside, and I've seen many great shops do this exact same thing and just reap the benefits of having really high employee engagement, low turnover, good solid performance. Um, so that's critical, of course. Obviously, as I mentioned earlier, trust with clients, customers is just paramount.
Yeah.
You want to speak a little bit about this?
Yeah. So I talk about creating sticky relationships. Um, and it's incredibly important in a turbulent world that we have high trust levels with our clients so that they give us the benefit of the doubt. So that when the world shifts and changes, they don't shift and change to a new provider with it, thinking that the grass will be greener on the other side of the fence.
Right.
We want them to actually talk to us about the challenges that they're facing. We want to be among the first to know what their real needs are or how their needs are changing. We
Hmm.
want to be included in that problem solving process rather than blamed for things that have gone wrong that may not be within our control.
Yeah.
And, you know, as someone who's just finished traveling with the airlines, um, I saw a lot of really unhappy clients. And they were all sort of, you know, frustrated and angry with their service provider instead of saying, wow, this whole process, this whole situation has led to a set of challenges that we're all trying to cope with.
Yeah.
And they're trying to do the best they can, and they're struggling just like we are. And so they weren't getting the benefit of the doubt. Um, what we strive for by building stronger relationships with our customers is to have them actually ask us, so why did that go wrong? What happened there? And how can I plan for future challenges? What do I need to do to minimize the chance of things going wrong in the future? And how can I help you serve me better? Boy, that's a different conversation than me blaming you because you're, you know, the parts didn't show up and you're a week late.
Hmm.
Um, yeah,
Yeah. Back in, every shop, I'm sure on the call today is familiar with clients that aren't don't have that sticky relationship and will move a job for a buck or two, right?
yeah,
And I gotta believe that's because, in part, they don't have a really deep connection and trust with that vendor. One of the things we did back in the Pro CNC days, we really doubled down on design for manufacturability consulting with our clients. We had newsletters and workshops, and we'd go on site and work with their teams for free. We didn't charge a penny for any of that. But I can tell you that built up deep levels of trust. And if they, we were looking to try to help them save money by not just cutting prices, but designing the cost out of their parts. And they those relationships are very, very sticky, right? They're
yeah.
even after we sold the shop. I know most of those clients are still doing business with them today. 10, 15 years later. Um, and just that, yeah, by investing in the relationship, being authentic, trying to serve them, that just builds trust.
Well, and you talked about price sensitivity, right? About us being, we're willing to pay a premium for in a lot of situations for a relationship with a producer that we trust, that we
Hmm.
believe in. And so we become a lot less sensitive to small changes in price.
Yeah. Yeah, I think buying organizations within the company, the buying departments and teams, their real goal is to reduce risk,
Yeah,
right? They want to make sure good quality parts arrive on time at a reasonably fair price.
yeah,
And if you can establish that level of trust that your quality is great, you're going to be there on time, you're going to solve any challenges with integrity. Yeah, price becomes not as important. So really big there. And of course, there's lots of other stakeholders, right? You can't, as a shop, you can't be successful without your vendors, without your material suppliers, your outside processors, investors potentially, and even family members. Like how many people have, especially shop owners. I remember going through this when our shop was small and young and not making any money yet. It had my wife had to trust that we were doing the right thing and the vision was a good one and that we'd eventually come through and be successful. So
right.
yeah,
Well,
so many people to support an organization.
yeah, and they're government stakeholders as well, right? Regulators
Of course.
who may actually hear you when you say this is a challenge and here's why it's a challenge.
Yeah.
They may believe you rather than thinking that you've got some ulterior motive They may start including you in conversations that impact your organization long term, and organizations that you're providing services to, you know, that go beyond just your immediate customers. Um, your customers are also stakeholders.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, we'll talk when we get to some later slides. I'll highlight two clients that did a remarkable job of building trust with their clients and really reaping the benefits of it financially. So we'll get to those a little bit later.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, I'd love to talk about how trust works.
Yeah. And so a lot of times we hear people talking about trust, we hear them talking about it at a really high level, and all this sort of theoretical junk that leaves us feeling like, well, what do I actually do with that? And I've over 20 years had a lot of chance to learn and grow and develop and be able to be more practical and applied with the approach that I take. And so when I think about trust, I think about it as a combination of uncertainty and vulnerability. I believe that people ask themselves two fundamental questions. And the first question is, if I trust you, how likely am I to be harmed? And the second question is, if I'm harmed, how bad is it going to hurt? And all of this stuff comes from the definition. And it's important that we have a shared understanding of what trust really is. And so when I talk about trust, I talk about it as a willingness to be vulnerable to somebody else when we can't completely predict how they're going to behave. And so you'll see that there's uncertainty and vulnerability are parts of that definition.
Mm-hmm.
And then they flow out into those two questions, which form the basis for trust. And so when we're deciding to trust someone, we ask ourselves, you know, how likely am I to be harmed? And if I'm harmed, how bad is it going to hurt? Those two things multiply together to give us a level of perceived risk.
Well, let's take a look at the graphic. Everyone loves
Yeah.
graphics here. Here's the formula.
Yeah.
This is
And
a pretty
so,
simple formula.
right. And so if we think about it in these terms, we each have a threshold of risk that we're comfortable with. And if our perception of the risk goes beyond that threshold, then we don't trust. And if it's beneath it, then we do. And so what we really need to understand is, how do we build deeper relationships? Well, it's about understanding, where does uncertainty come from and where does vulnerability come from, and taking steps to reduce those. And if we think early in a relationship, uncertainty is pretty high. And that means that the range of vulnerability we can tolerate is actually pretty low. And then as that relationship gets deeper, the level of uncertainty starts to go down. And so the range of vulnerability we can tolerate starts to grow. And let's think about early in a relationship. The first time you meet your significant other, your spouse to be, or whatever that relationship evolves into, you probably go someplace fairly safe, right? You go out with friends or you go for coffee. Low vulnerability because of the high uncertainty. And then as that relationship deepens, the uncertainty goes down, and we see that sort of depicted graphically here. We've taken steps to reduce uncertainty. That means that the level of perceived risk has declined and it's gone below that threshold. So we're able to trust.
Yeah. Yeah. In the context of a business relationship, right? You get a foot in the door, with a brand new potential client, with, who knows, your website, or you cold called them or whatever, and they're going to be skeptical at first, right? They don't know much about you, so there's some perceived uncertainty about, are you going to be a good vendor? Are you going to be on time? Do you have a good quality system? And if you can't communicate that you have all those things well in hand, with vendor, customer audit or visits, and talking about your past performance, giving them references to other clients, that
Right.
risk is going to be high, and they're going to be like, I'm not sure I want to give you that purchase order. But if you can allay those fears through multiple mechanisms, the risk goes down. They're willing to spend their money with you. So.
Right. And even before that, the vulnerability that they're experiencing can go back as far as, look, I have a limited amount of time. And so do I take your call, or do I push you off on somebody else?
Mm-hmm.
And So even the vulnerability of the time and energy they spend vetting you may be too much initially until you get the right materials in place in front of them to reduce their uncertainty. Like you said, having word of mouth or testimonials from other customers or a track record of success that you can point to that starts to make it easier for you to actually have that meaningful conversation with them. And it may be that the first thing you get is 10 minutes, and that 10 minutes gives you the opportunity to find out what information they need. You share information that they consume on their own time, and so that reduces the vulnerability a little bit. And then as that relationship deepens, they're willing to have more and more conversations with you leading up to that purchase order.
Right.
And it may be a small one to start with, and then that relationship deepens and the purchase orders get bigger. And then we start talking about a partnership where you're the sole supplier for whatever good or service they need.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. That I hadn't even told you about this case study I'm going to feature, but that plays perfectly into that in a few minutes. So
Nice.
let's continue on here. Yeah, let's talk about this one here.
Right. And so we've got these bases of trust, uncertainty, and vulnerability. They lead to that trust decision, which is that comparison of, you know, my perception of the risk threshold versus the perception of risk that I have. So if it goes beyond, I'm not trusting. If it's beneath, then I do. And then it leads to something that I call perceived outcomes. And the word perceived is really important because we've got I believe 50 some folks on the webinar today, and some of them are going to have different perspectives on what just happened. So we can have exactly the same experience and have significantly different perspectives on what happened or what didn't. We see that playing out in the United States right now, right? So we have different perspectives on uh, the the last election. We have different perspectives on what happened on January 6th. We have different perspectives on Roe versus Wade. And so we're seeing exactly the same events transpire, but we're seeing dramatically different perspectives or perceptions
Mm-hmm.
of the quality of that outcome and who's responsible for that outcome, which has a significant impact the next time we engage or interact. And so if we think about this from your customer's perspective, you're either delivering the product or you're not. But is it on time? How is it delivered? What's the quality of the product? We can actually be involved in that perception of the outcome because we interpret the world through stories.
Mm-hmm.
And so there are all kinds of different places where we can lean in to try to strengthen the relationship. In the middle of all this are our emotional states, whether we like or dislike somebody else. And so there are some people who really like Trump. There are some people who really don't. Um, that has a significant impact on how they view what happens, what transpires.
Sure.
And we see this same thing with our customers, with our clients. If we've developed a positive bond, a positive, strong relationship with them, they're more likely to give us the benefit of the doubt. They look for evidence that confirms that story, that we're a good guy, that we're a good producer. They're more likely to trust us in the case where they like us. And they're more likely to see those outcomes as positive.
Mm-hmm.
Or if those outcomes are negative, they're more likely to attribute that to the environment than they are to us.
Right.
And that makes them like us even more.
Right.
And the flip side of that is these sort of vicious cycles that we tend to see where people don't like one another.
Mm-hmm.
And they look for evidence to confirm that they shouldn't trust us. They're less likely to trust us. And they see the outcomes as more negative.
Right.
And this is dramatically different than most of the research you'll see or most of the popular press stuff you'll see on trust, because 99% of the material you'll see or read treats people like they're rational actors. And I don't know if the other folks on the webinar have met people before or not, but we're not always rational, Paul. We're
Sure.
and partly so as a caveat, I like Paul a lot. He and I get along really well, and so I have a real positive perspective on Paul. And I really like the team that I worked with at ProShop, so I have a positive story about them.
Mm-hmm.
Which means that my engagements with them tend to be, I look for evidence to confirm the fact that they're a really good group of folks. They're good to work with. as a service provider, as someone who's now trying to partner with them to try to help them strengthen their relationship. And I see, I interpret their action of bringing me to talk to their clients as one of benevolence, as one of trying to do what's best for their clients, because you're not getting paid for
Right.
this webinar,
Sure.
right? And so we see that, we interpret that positively, we find a positive story that fits those actions that you're taking, which tends to make us like each other even more.
Hmm.
Yeah.
I'm going to pull in another concept that I hadn't thought about before, but something you said. So, one of the books that was most impactful in the early days of our machine shop, Pro CNC, was a book called The E Myth. And the concept of that book is that if you run your business like a franchise and give your customer a very repeatable, consistent output all the time, they like that, right? Think about people going to Starbucks every day and getting their favorite coffee. They know it's going to be the same every day. They probably look forward to that to that experience. Their perceived uncertainty of what they're going to get in their coffee is really low, and we did that. We took those principles and applied it to our shop, and basically any touch point we had with clients was engineered to be in accordance with what that customer told us they wanted, right?
Right.
Whether it was the way their paperwork was formatted, whether they wanted their status updates via email or phone calls or what have you. Um, and I think we built up a lot of trust with them that we were very consistent, very reliable, and there was a lack of friction in that
Yeah.
relationship, and that turned into positive feelings and emotions about Pro CNC, which I think led to stickiness.
Absolutely. and
And
and we see that play out at different levels of engagement, right? So we see that play out with McDonald's,
hmm
where they try to create a consistent experience for customers around the world. But
yep,
we also, I worked for McKinsey and Company, big management consulting firm, and we created a level of consistency for our clients so that they knew what to expect.
right,
And, as someone who first entered that organization and saw, I was in a training program, I saw people who were a couple of years ahead of me at McKinsey, and I turned to my colleagues and I said, wow, they all look the same, they all talk the same, they all dress the same. This is a little scary. And then it was 18 months later, I realized I was one of those people.
right,
And it was really intentional. It allowed us to work more effectively together, but it created a comfort for our customers. And this brings us beautifully to this notion of context,
hmm
right? So context plays a role, and I think of context as the rules of the game, right? It's the thing that constrains our behavior. And so when I worked at McKinsey, there were a lot of formats and approaches that we took to solving problems, to communicating with the world, that led to a consistency of response from each of us. And, as I said, I used to be a consultant, so I had to have a 2x2 matrix. And because otherwise all the other consultants would make fun of me. So you'll see that I treat context as a 2x2 matrix.
right,
And I think about it as the formal and informal mechanisms of social control that constrain our behavior.
hmm
And the more effective we are at communicating this, the less uncertainty other folks have about us, the easier it is to predict our behavior.
sure,
And so at Pro Shop, you guys wanted to create a consistency of experience for your customers. And that's exactly what I talk to a lot of my clients about. Every time a client touches us, they should have a consistent experience. And every time they touch our organization, you showed what your mission statement was. Well, as a customer who's engaging with ProShop, I should be able to think about, hey, was my experience consistent with that mission statement? And as an employee within ProShop, I should be able to say, yeah, the decisions that are being made, the actions that I take are consistent with that mission statement, because that mission statement has become part of our context.
right,
And so the formal elements of social control are things like job descriptions, rules, regulations, laws, uh, incentive structures. Those are all things that are sort of formal mechanisms of social control that will constrain our behaviors within a different setting. The informal things are things like our relationships, our reputation, the values and norms that we bring to organizations. And I work with some larger software companies. I've worked with the Canadian military trying to help them figure out how to build trust with the locals in Afghanistan. Context is actually really powerful and important because it sends a signal early on. So before somebody gets to know you, Paul, they know ProShop, and they have an expectation about what that experience is going to be. And for a lot of your clients, they have an expectation about what a manufacturing firm is going to be like, or uh, what a particular shop is going to be like before they get to know the people that they engage with, the customer service or the sales folks. And that, we talked about how do we reduce uncertainty? Well, part of it is through the context. Part of it is explaining, here's how I'm constrained. Here are the things that limit what I can and can't do. And so part of it is us communicating our context more clearly to one another. And part of it is we can take steps within the context. So ProShop has its mission statement, and partly you've imposed that on your organization as a means of restraining your behavior or constraining your actions, so that your customers can hold that up to you and say, how are you doing this for me today?
Right.
It's a way to signal to the world, this is what's important to us as an organization, and if we're not doing this, you should be asking us about that.
Yeah, and I also think about, especially on the internal side, with employees, is core values.
Right.
In my, for those that may not know, I have a new podcast called the Machine Shop Mastery Podcast. It's unrelated to ProShop, but some of my most recent guests have talked about just how critical it has been and how successful it has been for them to establish and publish and really talk about their core values with their team. And that helps in so many different ways, get everyone aligned and working together. And they, when they see someone demonstrating one of those values, they celebrate them for that
Yeah.
particular action of the value that they were demonstrating. And yeah.
So, and I'm going to take a step further here.
Sure.
I'm going to suggest that people implementing ProShop, and because it sounds salesy if you do it, but if I do it, if then implementing ProShop is a way of starting to signal and solidify their context. Because ProShop has an impact on how they do business.
Right.
It has an impact on how they report. It has an impact, and it creates a consistency within that organization. So something like ProShop is a mechanism for actually establishing your context in a way that's more consistent across the organization, and in a way that you can communicate to other people outside in the world. You can say, hey, we have a software process that forces us to think about the following things, that forces us to engage with our work in the following way, that creates a level of consistency that we maybe didn't have before.
Sure. Yeah, I like that. One other thing I just thought about in the realm of context that is relevant to shops, any shop today,
Yeah.
is something like material availability. Right? There's this. You're probably not familiar with this, Darryl, but raw materials right now are very hard to come by. The lead times are longer. The prices are higher. And so that is a constraint that every shop is dealing with. And the way that they communicate that constraint to their customers and what they're doing about that, hey, we've gotten quotes from 10 different vendors and we're putting in some long-term blanket orders to make sure that we can always have material to support you and your needs. That's really important, as opposed to not communicating, not sharing, what you're doing about that issue.
Yeah.
That's going to build more trust with your client than not addressing it head on. So
Powerful example, because who of us has not, tried to travel or get a hotel and thought, hey, is this because their costs have gone up, or is this because they're trying to recoup the losses that they have? We interpret the world through stories, and as we help people understand, this is the situation we're stuck in,
right.
And here's, we're all stuck together.
Yeah.
And here's the approach that we're taking. So helping people interpret that world
Mm-hmm.
through a story that's more consistent with the one that you have, or at least sharing your story.
Yeah.
Powerful tool.
Yeah. So let's talk about some of these trust levers.
Yeah. So when I think about trust, I think about it. I believe we all have the ability to build trust, and I think about it as a continuum. And so some people who aren't great at building trust have a lever that they pull, and they pull it over and over again, just hoping that it'll line up with the struggles that they're facing or the problem that their client is facing. Those who are a bit better have multiple levers that they can pull. And those who are really good have multiple levers and they know when to pull which one. And so you'll see here that we actually have 12 levers lined up here. And so we've got levers that relate to uncertainty. We've talked about, where does uncertainty come from? Well, it comes from us as individuals, and it comes from the context that we're embedded in. And then we've got a couple levers when we talk about vulnerability. Um, and understanding the vulnerability that the other party is facing or experiencing. We've got levers that we can pull when it comes to perceptions of outcomes and managing that story and creating a shared narrative and a shared understanding of what a good outcome looks like.
Mm-hmm.
And context plays a role in each of these different settings. So it actually serves as 4 different levers that we can think about. It shows up in uncertainty. It shows up in our perceptions of vulnerability. It shows up in our interpretation of the context. And it also has an impact on us emotionally. So if I'm talking with your customers and I'm talking about, you know, Trump versus Biden, I may be triggering an emotional response.
Sure.
And I'm not saying either one is good or bad. I'm just saying that even mentioning those two can trigger an emotional response. So the context has an impact on us emotionally as well. And so we can go through and systematically, and this is what I did with you folks over 12 weeks, is we walked through each of these levers and talked about, here's how you pull that lever. Let's practice. Let's have some coaching. Let's have some group conversations around taking a deeper dive on each of those. So I hope your participants on the webinar aren't thinking, wow, this is a bait and switch. He's not going to tell us everything. I'm going to tell you as much as we can manage in an hour.
Mm-hmm.
And my goal and our goal is to leave you with some ideas about things you can actually do. But we can't cover everything.
Sure.
Right? We just can't get there. And so if we think about the individual components, that's where we're going to dive a little deeper today, because it's a place where we tend to have a bit more control. And we can think about this as, the people on the webinar can think about this, but organizations more broadly can think about, how do we show people that they can trust us? How do we create more clarity? How do we reduce uncertainty? And so there was a great article, if you're an academic, there was a great article written in 1995 by a friend of mine named Roger Mayer Davis and Squirman. And I cite these things not because I think you care, but because I don't want to try to take credit for stuff that isn't mine. Mm-hmm. And so they identified 3 levers that make people think we're more trustworthy. And those levers were benevolence, integrity, and ability. And benevolence is this belief that you've got my best interest at heart, that you'll act in my best interest. And integrity is, do I actually follow through on my promises? And do my actions line up with the values that I express? And so at the start of this whole thing, you talked about what the mission statement was for ProShow. And now we're engaging in actions that should line up with that, right? That hopefully people interpret as consistent with that. And then ability is, do I actually have the competence to do what I say I'm going to do? And that tends to be our favorite lever, right? If we think about
ability,
we've got X years of experience, we've got X kinds of credentials, we've got X number of satisfied customers. That's the lever we pull a lot. And I got to tell you, in times that are really chaotic and changing and as turbulent as what we're seeing right now, that lever gets harder to pull because excellence is a moving target. Mm-hmm. And in part, often we don't include other people in the definition of these things. I'll work with leadership groups, with senior executives, and I'll say, I'll talk about these three levers, and they'll say, well, I'll do all those things. And my response is often, says who, right? Because if it's me telling you that I'm benevolent, that really doesn't carry as much weight as you saying, you know what, Darryl showed up and he tried to really help us get better at what we do, or tried to help us understand trust in a better way. He actually seemed like he cared and that he was benevolent. That's where we get traction, is when other people think that we're showing benevolence, integrity, and ability.
So let's dig into some of those. How do we show benevolence to people?
Right. And so I actually think that benevolence is the lever that's the most powerful in really turbulent times, because ability is a moving target. Integrity gets harder because values are shifting, and it's harder for us to make promises. You talked about supply chain challenges. Everyone's experiencing that. So meeting our commitments, following through on them is more challenging than ever. But we can always try to think about somebody else's best interest. We can always try to have their back. And so a lot of times, when I work with families, I'll ask them who here has their kid's best interest at heart, and all the hands go up. It's a powerful, stirring sight. And then I'll say, how many of your kids would say that? And usually it's about a third, right? And somewhat hesitantly at that. And so if it's hard for us to have benevolence land properly in a place where it's supposed to be obvious,
Right.
how hard is it when we're running an organization, or when we're a team leader, where we see conflicting needs and interests? And so, how do I show benevolence? Well, in part, it starts with a conversation. And I would argue that right now, ProShop is showing benevolence by bringing me alongside to talk to your clients about trust and the importance of it, and trying to give them a sense of how to do it. So I would believe that ProShop is showing benevolence right
Mm-hmm.
now. And I'm, okay, so I'm a fairly humble guy, but I've presented this stuff in front of academics around the world. I've presented it the world over. I spoke at Harvard, and people say, yeah, this is how it works. And so I'm not just some guy that you dug up in the backyard. I actually have a bit of an understanding, and I've got this sort of rare blend of deep theoretical knowledge and practical applied experience. And so you bringing me to them at no cost to them is actually an act of benevolence.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think about the thing that I mentioned earlier about us holding workshops and visits to our clients unrelated to any orders we were doing, unrelated to anything specifically related to transactional business. And that was like, we hear about people, what's the phrase, you know um, putting deposits in that bank of trust.
Yeah.
And if you're just putting in, keep dropping coins in, things that you're doing to show kindness and compassion and caring, truly for your customer as an organization, and the people within that organization too, right? Developing a close relationship with the buyers, with the engineers, with
Yeah.
whoever that might be. Um,
Yeah. And I would bet that you've, with the experiences that you've had and the case studies that you develop, you've probably got examples on your at your fingertips of clients who've shown benevolence towards their customers.
sure. Oh, all the time. Yeah.
Yeah.
Um,
And
and
so part of the challenge for us, because I've said this can be hard to do. And a lot of times when I say that, if I've got two people sitting in a room in front of me and I say, okay, well, how would you be benevolent to them? I don't know. And then if I ask the other person, so if it was you and I, Paul, and I said, well, how could I be benevolent to you? It may just, you feel stuck, right? Because you're not practiced at using that word.
mm-hmm.
I've got a PhD. I have to use the odd big word, or people will suspect that I'm just faking it. And so, when we start to think about how do we pull that benevolence lever, well, it starts with a conversation. It starts, with some introspection. And so if I thought, what's in Paul's best interest? Well, I think Paul's a great guy and he's trying to create stronger relationships with his customers. And that's part of what drives Paul's success. Well, for me to try to show benevolence towards Paul, then I would show up here and try to help him articulate for his clients how to be better,
Mm-hmm.
because that's something that's important to Paul.
Right.
And so partly it's that conversation around, and we give people templates, in the workshops that we do, you experience this. I just recently wrote a book. When I talk through it, there's a set of questions that we can ask that can help prime this for us. And so imagine you're having a conversation with someone and you say to them, hey, so I just saw this webinar with this guy who talks about trust. And it's got me thinking I could be more intentional about the relationships that I build. And one of the things he talked about was benevolence. And I think I have benevolence, but it doesn't always seem to land that way. Have you ever experienced that? Where you're trying to do something in somebody's best interest and it just falls flat?
Sure.
Yeah. And so, but what did it look like when somebody was really benevolent to you? Have you ever had that happen?
Right.
And it starts to get them
Feels
thinking
great.
about this,
Yeah.
right? And then you say, well, what did it look like? What did they do? And now you're starting to get hints. And then you dig a little deeper and you say, well, what would success look like for you? And how could I help you get there? What would it look like if I was benevolent to you? And then we start to dig this up together. And it's a collaborative conversation where I start to understand what your needs are. And then I'm able to be transparent.
Mm.
And now, so, we move to the integrity and I'm conscious of the time.
Yep.
Because I don't want to keep people too late. And we do want to answer questions.
Yep.
And so if we think about doing the same thing with integrity, again, it's a conversation. It's what are the promises that you think I'm making? Because we fall down sometimes in integrity because we overpromise and then sometimes we fail to deliver.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And
That
so go ahead.
that's particularly important, I think, in manufacturing in the machine shop business. I experienced so many times where a shop told a client, "Yeah, we can do that. We can deliver this
Yeah.
part," and then they totally fall on their face, and the client comes scrambling, to us saying, "Hey, what can you do to help us out in this situation?" And I think you can build that longer term trust and by showing this integrity of just being more realistic, saying,
Yeah.
I don't think we can take that order this time, right? I'm looking at our capacity, I'm looking at what, how busy we are, and we just, we can't do that date. I
Right.
could offer you this other date. Maybe that's not what they want to hear, but if you're realistic about it and then you build up a long-term reputation for being, reliable and realistic, and then
Yeah.
when you do make those mistakes, something happens, the material doesn't show up and you are going to be late, taking ownership of your mistakes, saying, "Hey, this happened, and that bad news does not age well, so always do it, as soon as possible."
Right.
Not like a fine wine. Material didn't show up, so it looks like we're going to have to slide, the date a week. This is what we're going to do to recover.
Right.
I'm going to do this. I'm going to do that. I'm going to take all these steps. I'm so sorry. We're doing our best to recover. That that in and of itself shows integrity, as opposed to just
Absolutely.
not communicating.
Well, and
Just
being careful about the promises that we make, making sure that they're promises around things we have control over.
sure.
So promises about the effort we're going to make or the steps we're going to take. But you talked about supply chain issues. Well, if I'm trying to provide for you and I say to you, look, we would like to meet this date, but here's the things that have to happen for that to happen.
Hmm.
And here's the steps that we're going to take, and we'll keep you in the loop all the way through.
Right.
Um, that allows us to have more integrity than saying you're going to have it by X date, and then coming back to them and saying, yeah, you know what, the stuff just didn't show up.
Right.
We can't make it out of thin air.
Right. Yep. And then last one, the one we pull most often is ability.
Right.
Um,
And
and
and we often define what ability is on our own, and in reality, we should be including other people.
mhm.
Right. So if I said, hey, I'm a great webinar guy, um, And there were some people in the audience saying, yeah, I didn't like some of the words he used, or I didn't like the way he talked about it, or I didn't understand some of these things. Well, then maybe I'm not such a great webinar guy, and I should have probably included other people in that conversation before I made that statement.
Mm-hmm. Right.
And you know, there may be things that, and I have these conversations with people when I teach. You know, when I teach MBAs or when I work with senior executives, I'll say, "What do you think good looks like?"
Right.
Let's have a conversation, a shared understanding of what excellence is. And, you know, again, I bet you've got a story about, you know, because I think ProShop does a great job of trying to meet clients' needs, but I bet you've got stories at hand about people who thought they were exceptional. And it turned out their clients didn't really think so because there were pieces missing.
Uh, yes, in fact. Funny. Um, so I want to highlight two clients that I think have done some remarkable jobs here. The first one, East Branch Engineering, they were dual sourced on a project. They made half the parts. Another vendor made the other half, and their customer got bought out and decided to pare down their vendor base. So they came through doing a very detailed supplier audit of both companies with the express. Abra just dropped that article in the chat. Thank you, Abra. With the express goal of eliminating one of the vendors, and just the way that East Branch, showed up, did that audit, showed them their systems that allowed that client to build up a much higher level of trust in their ability to perform in the long term compared to that other vendor.
Right.
They won the business. They weren't the one that was cut, and that went on to be a huge financial win. And then right now I'm working on a case study with Beacon Industries, who and the picture we're seeing here is an assembly they produce much of for Raytheon, where when there is a long-term contract issued, the supplier team comes out and does a detailed, what they call post award review, where they look at all the flow downs, all the requirements, all the things that might need to be handled in the course of executing that contract. And in the past, Beacon, they have high technical ability, incredible machines, beautiful equipment, but their prior system really lacked some of the things that gave their customer trust that they could handle all the little paperwork and the details and make sure everything came in clean and the paperwork was perfect. But after implementing ProShop, that process went so well. Instead of a 3-day audit, it took 5 hours,
Right.
and gave that customer such a high level of confidence and trust in their ability to perform that they gave them 3 more contracts shortly thereafter.
Yeah.
So, yeah, it can be obviously quite impactful. So we just have a couple of minutes left, and there are a couple of questions. So we'll get through this one real quick.
Yeah. So ask, listen, respond is the mantra that I get people to use. This is part of how we diagnose where the gaps might be, right? So we ask first questions that sort of provoke a conversation. Is the gap around benevolence? Is it around integrity? Is it around ability? Or is it in the context somewhere? And then we listen. We actually fundamentally pay attention. And then the respond piece is we start to tell our own story. We start to try to send signals or pull levers to build trust that is consistent with where we're finding the gap.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And people can go on to, we're going to tell them at the end, but they can go on the website. There are articles, there are podcasts. So the website's trustunlimited.com. So all kinds of free content there for people to go through and look at and review. And I suspect you're going to share these slides with anyone who wants them, the participants. You certainly have my permission to do that.
Yeah, we'll send the recording out in the slides for sure. So yeah, call to action. What should people do today to start building more trust in their organizations?
So the first step is introspection. Are trust levels where I think they should be? And let's go back to the definition. Trust is the willingness to be vulnerable when you can't completely predict how someone else is going to behave. So that introspection piece is, how can people be vulnerable to me? And then are they? Right. So do clients tell me what their real needs are or going to be? Do they tell me what other people are sort of pushing or pressuring them for? Do they tell me what the challenges that they're facing are? Do they open the kimono and share with me what some of the challenges are that they're facing? If I'm a leader, do people give me their real development needs? Do they push back against ideas? Are they making mistakes? Right? Because if everyone's terrified of making a mistake, then we've got an environment where people are not able to innovate, not able to be adaptive and agile. And so there are signals in the environment that tell us the trust levels are low. And we see things like high turnover rates, high levels of political infighting or rumors or all those kinds of things. So introspection is the first, conversation is the second. We want to start engaging people in conversations about trust and trying to demystify it a bit. And it's not voodoo, right? And this is one of the challenges we face, is that sometimes people say, well, trust is so complicated and so fuzzy. It's not. You know, we've shown you a model now that helps you deconstruct certain problems. And then if you start to practice with and play with, you'll start to see that there are conversations that can be had around, well, do you feel like I've got your best interest at heart? Or what would benevolence look like? Or what would integrity look like? Do you feel like we followed through on that? Being transparent, those kinds of conversations. And then the last is, can we start to get a better understanding? There's books about trust. There's podcasts and articles. Some are more helpful than others, but each of these is going to give you a bit of insight. And so you can start to search for additional information to dig a bit deeper. And you're welcome to reach out to ProShop, because they have a very good perspective on not only their own product, but also the focus, that the journey that they're on around getting even better at something that they're already quite good at. You're welcome to reach out to me. But there are places where we can start to search for additional information.
Yep. And thank you. And I'll plug your book. Came out.
Thanks.
We have
it's a week old now.
Yeah. We snapped up about 50 copies for our team. So I think Avra is going to drop the Amazon. Yeah, Emily, yes. The link to Amazon. So a couple of questions that have come in. So Dan had asked, what are some of the specific examples of pulling trust levers for each one? I think we've already kind of covered that in the webinar. We talked about different ways to show ability, empathy, and
integrity.
And integrity, yes, integrity.
Yeah, and if we didn't cover it clearly enough, Dan, feel free to send an email, and I'll share some more content with you, and that goes for anyone.
And then a question James asked: how do I even start? Very
right
question, but hopefully those 3 steps that you shared, starting with conversations, introspection, and looking for more information. Am cognizant of our time. We do need to wrap things up. I'm just going to very quickly launch this poll. I don't know how many folks we will get to respond to it, but if you have another minute, there's only 2 questions. Love to see what you think about that. And as we go, I just wanted to bring up our contact information. So yeah, Darryl has some great resources on his website, and I will, not business related at all, but I will throw out here, when I went through that 12-week course, building higher levels of trust with my youngest teenage son was really on my mind at that time, and he has a great article about that. So the intentional work I did to build that relationship better is incredibly meaningful. I'm sure any parent would understand that. So if that's something that you have intention to do, definitely go out and read some of those articles on his website there. So thank you all so much for joining today. I really appreciate the attention. Darryl, thank you for bringing your wisdom and experience to this audience.
My pleasure.
Yeah, really appreciate it. This is a topic that is maybe a little bit uncomfortable and not obvious on everyone's mind, but I can assure you that by putting in the work to build trust with your team, with your customers, with all your stakeholders, that's going to only lead to more success for you as a company. So thank you all again very much. Appreciate it. Thank you, Darryl.
All right.
And we'll catch you on the next webinar.
And we'll talk soon. Thanks, folks.
Take care. Bye.